I remember exactly what my mother was wearing the morning everything started to change, even though I didn't know yet that it was starting. A cream-colored coat with a belt cinched tight at the waist, the kind of coat that photographs well. Gold hoop earrings. Boots with a heel sharp enough to click against tile in a way that made people look up. She walked me to my classroom door that morning, knelt down in front of me the way she always did when there might be an audience, straightened the collar of my shirt, and said, "Be good today, sweetheart," in the voice she used for teachers and neighbors and anyone else whose opinion of her mattered more than mine did. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who had her life completely together. That was always the performance. I understood, even at 8 years old, that the performance and the truth were two very different things living in the same house. My name is Nadia. I was born with a condition that affected the nerves in my right leg, nothing that stopped me from walking, but enough that I needed a leg brace fitted twice a year as I grew, regular sessions with a physical therapist named Coach Dana, and shoes built with a reinforced sole that cost more than regular shoes because regular shoes wore through in weeks on my foot instead of months. None of that was a secret. What was a secret, what I didn't fully understand until I was old enough to do the math myself, was that the state sent money into my mother's account every month specifically for those things. $640, I would later learn. For 3 years, almost none of it went where it was supposed to go. My brace had been too tight since the spring. I told my mother. She said we'd get to it. My physical therapy sessions had quietly dropped from twice a week to once a month, then to nothing at all, and when I asked why Coach Dana didn't come around the community center on Tuesdays anymore, my mother said Coach Dana had gotten busy. Meanwhile, there were new things in the apartment. A television too big for the wall we hung it on. A leather handbag she kept on the good chair so nothing would touch it. A vacation to somewhere warm that she talked about for weeks before we left and for weeks after we got back, showing photos to anyone who'd look. I didn't understand money at 8. But I understood the shape of a gap. I understood that some things filled up and other things stayed empty, and I was the empty one. By the end of October, the brace had rubbed 2 raw, weeping sores into the skin above my ankle, right where the plastic had gotten too small to sit properly anymore. I showed my mother every night for almost 3 weeks. She'd look, wince in a way that seemed real, and say, "I know, baby, I'm handling it," and then nothing would happen, and the next night I'd show her again. I started favoring that leg, walking with a hitch I hadn't had before, trying to keep the brace from rubbing the worst spot. That's the kind of thing an 8-year-old thinks is invisible and an adult who's paying attention notices immediately. My teacher, Miss Holloway, noticed. She kept me back after the other kids filed out for recess, crouched down so we were eye level, and asked if she could look at my leg. I rolled my sock down without really thinking about whether I should. The skin above my ankle was an angry, shiny red, broken open in 2 places. "How long has it looked like this?" she asked. "A while." "Has your mom seen it?" "Yeah." "Is the brace not fitting right?" "It got too small." I told her. "When did you tell her?" "Since the summer." Ms. Holloway was quiet for a moment, and I watched her decide something, the way adults sometimes visibly arrive at a conclusion before they say it out loud. "Nadia," she said carefully, "does your family have trouble affording things sometimes? Is that why the brace hasn't been replaced?" "No," I said, and I remember being almost offended by the question, because I'd absorbed, without anyone teaching me directly, the idea that money problems were shameful and my mother didn't have that particular shame. "My mom buys a lot of stuff. She just doesn't buy stuff for me." I watched Ms. Holloway's face when I said it. Something in her expression shifted, not shock exactly, more like the settling of a suspicion into a certainty. I told her everything after that, because once I'd said the first true thing out loud, the rest came easier than I expected. The brace. Therapy stopping. The nights the refrigerator held nothing but condiments and a carton of eggs because my mother had gone out and hadn't planned for dinner. The new handbag. The vacation. The way she'd cry sometimes if I brought up money, so I'd learned to stop bringing it up. When I finished, Ms. Holloway put her hand over mine on the desk. You did the right thing telling me, she said. I need you to know that. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing. She didn't make it dramatic. When my mother picked me up that afternoon, Ms. Holloway greeted her the same as always, pleasant, unremarkable. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, including my mother, was that Ms. Holloway had already made a phone call during her lunch break, documented the condition of my leg with 2 photographs on her personal phone, and written down, word for word while it was still fresh, everything I'd told her. By the time my mother buckled me into the car that afternoon, the clock had already started. 2 days later, a woman named Ms. Petrosky came to my classroom and asked to speak with me in the small office near the front of the school, the one usually used for reading assessments. She had a laminated badge on a lanyard and a soft, careful way of asking questions that made it clear she'd done this many times before, with many different children, and knew exactly how much weight each question could bear. Do you feel safe at home? Yes. Does anyone ever hurt you? No. Is there enough food, most days? I hesitated on that one, because most days felt like it needed an honest answer instead of a reflexive one. Some days there isn't a lot, I said. But I'm not, like, starving or anything. She wrote something down without making it feel like an accusation. The main thing that's been hard, I told her, because it felt important to be specific, is my leg stuff. The brace and the doctor visits. What I didn't know was that Miss Petrosky's real work that week wasn't happening in that small office with me. It was happening on a computer somewhere, where she was pulling 3 years of paperwork my mother had filed with the state, reimbursement claims, itemized statements, appointment records, all of it submitted on time, all of it looking, on the surface, completely legitimate. The numbers matched. The categories were right: brace maintenance, physical therapy co-pays, orthopedic shoe replacement, transportation to appointments. It was only when Ms. Petrosky called the clinic listed on the paperwork that the first thread came loose. The clinic had no record of most of the appointments. Coach Dana, when reached by phone, said she hadn't seen me in over 4 months, not the bi-weekly ongoing care the paperwork claimed. The expenses were real numbers attached to appointments that had never happened. A state investigator came to our apartment on a Thursday evening, unannounced except for a single phone call an hour earlier that had sent my mother into a flurry of straightening cushions and lighting a candle that made the living room smell like vanilla instead of whatever it usually smelled like. I heard her voice at the door go warm and easy, the tone she used for landlords and my school's front office and anyone who might write something down about her later. I sat at the kitchen table with a coloring book open in front of me and didn't move, because moving felt like it might break whatever fragile arrangement was keeping the evening calm. Afterward, once the investigator had left, my mother crouched in front of me the way Ms. Holloway had crouched, except it didn't feel the same at all. "That's just routine paperwork stuff, baby," she said. "Nothing to worry about." "Did anything happen at school that I should know about?" "No," I said, and held very still, the way you hold still around something that might bite if it senses you moving. The following week, an envelope arrived with a state seal printed in the corner. I caught a glimpse of the logo before my mother slid it off the counter and turned her back to open it. I watched her shoulders go rigid as she read, and then, slowly, settle into something that looked less like anger and more like a person doing complicated arithmetic in her head and not liking the answer she was getting. 2 days after that, without any explanation, she drove me to a medical supply store I'd never been to before. She told the woman behind the counter that she felt terrible, that things had gotten away from her lately, that she wanted the best brace available, price no object. She used the word terrible 4 separate times on the drive home, like she was rehearsing it for an audience that wasn't in the car. "You know I always take care of you, don't you, baby?" she said at a red light, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yes," I said, and looked out the window at a gas station sign instead of at her. Ms. Petrosky came back every 3 weeks after that, and every time, my mother performed flawlessly. The refrigerator was stocked. A wall calendar appeared in the kitchen with physical therapy appointments written in marker, all of them real this time, all of them attended. My new brace fit correctly and didn't rub. On paper, and in person, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. I started to wonder, somewhere around the third visit, whether I had actually changed anything, or whether I had simply taught my mother to be better at hiding the same thing. The sores on my leg had healed. But something else in the apartment had gotten quieter and more careful in a way that felt less like honesty and more like caution. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in February, I came home from school early because of a teacher in-service day nobody had told her about, and found her on the phone in her bedroom with the door almost, but not quite, closed. Through the gap, I heard the voice she never used around me, flatter, faster, without any of the warmth she saved for people who might report her. "The caseworker's going to close it out if we get through 3 more clean visits," she was saying. "It's basically over. I've already got most of it moved into the account in my sister's name, so even if they audit backward, it won't trace clean." A pause, someone on the other end asking something I couldn't hear. "Then, she's 8. 9 in the spring. Kids that age can't hold a story together for long. Nobody's going to believe a kid over 3 years of paperwork." I stood very still in the hallway with my backpack still on both shoulders. "Kids that age can't hold a story together." She thought I'd made noise by accident, the way a child cries out without meaning anything by it. She thought the leg, the brace, the sores, she thought all of it had been an outburst that would fade the way tantrums fade. What she didn't know was that I had just heard her say, out loud, in her own voice, the entire plan, and that I had memorized every word of it standing in that hallway before she'd even noticed I was home. I didn't tell her I'd heard anything. I went to my room, sat on my bed, and went over the sentences in my head so many times that by the time I fell asleep that night, I could have recited them the way I recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning without thinking about the words at all. My next appointment with Ms. Petrosky wasn't for another 2 weeks, but I didn't want to wait. The next morning, I asked Ms. Holloway if I could talk to her again, the same way I had in October, and something in my face must have told her this conversation was going to matter, because she cleared her lunch period without asking why first. I told her everything. Not just what I'd heard, but as close to word for word as I could manage, the account in my aunt's name, the phrase 3 more clean visits, the specific certainty in my mother's voice that a child my age couldn't hold a story together long enough to matter. Ms. Holloway wrote it all down while it was fresh, the same way she had in October, and then she called Ms. Petrosky directly instead of waiting for the scheduled visit. Ms. Petrosky came to the school that same afternoon. She listened to everything without interrupting, and I watched her face carefully while I talked, trying to figure out whether she believed me the way she'd believed the paperwork, or whether "kids that age can't hold a story together" was about to turn out to be true after all. When I finished, she asked me one question I hadn't expected. "Do you remember which sister? A first name, anything at all?" I did remember. My mother had exactly one sister, a woman named Renee who lived 2 states away and who I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, mostly at holidays neither of them seemed especially happy to be at. I gave Ms. Petrosky the name. "That's enough for us to start looking somewhere specific," she said. "You didn't just tell me your mom is hiding money, Nadia. You gave me a place to find it. That matters more than you probably realize right now." What happened over the following 6 weeks, I only understand in full now, years later, from records I was eventually allowed to read as part of my own case file. At the time, I experienced it the way a child experiences most adult processes, in fragments, through overheard phone calls and unexplained visitors and the particular quality of silence that falls over a house when the adults in it know something is coming and are trying very hard not to let it show. Investigators traced a transfer of $11,000 from an account in my mother's name into an account belonging to my Aunt Renee, made in 3 installments over the previous 4 months. Renee, when contacted, initially claimed the money was a repayment for an old loan. Under further questioning, and faced with the fact that no loan had ever been reported to exist prior to the timing of the disability payments, she changed her story, then changed it again, and eventually admitted, in exchange for not being charged herself, that my mother had asked her to hold some money for a while and had been vague, deliberately vague, about why. The paperwork my mother had filed for 3 years, the fabricated appointments, the padded receipts, the invented equipment purchases, became, once investigators knew exactly where to look and what to look for, much easier to unravel than it had been to build in the first place. Fraud built to survive a glance rarely survives someone who already knows it's fraud and is looking specifically for the seams. I was moved, temporarily, into the home of a foster family 2 towns over while the investigation continued, a decision that terrified me at the time in a way I hadn't expected, because as angry as I was, as much as I understood, in the abstract, that what my mother had done was wrong, some stubborn 8-year-old part of me had still hoped that telling the truth would somehow fix things without unmaking them entirely. It didn't work that way. Truth doesn't unhappen the thing it exposes. It just stops the thing from continuing to happen in the dark. The foster family I stayed with was quiet in a way our apartment had never been. A couple named the Whitfields, older, their own kids grown and out of the house, who didn't perform warmth the way my mother performed it but who also didn't withhold it the way she'd withheld everything else. Mrs. Whitfield drove me to physical therapy twice a week without being asked twice, without a calendar hung up for anyone's benefit but mine. I remember the first time she took me to get my brace checked, how strange it felt to sit in a waiting room without the specific tension I'd learned to associate with appointments, the tension of wondering whether this one would actually happen, whether the person calling my name would find a cancelled slot instead of me sitting there. Ms. Petrosky visited every 2 weeks during that period, and eventually, gently, without making it feel like an interrogation, she started asking me questions about what I wanted, going forward, not what I was supposed to want, not what would make the process easier, but what I actually wanted, which nobody had asked me in longer than I could remember. I told her I didn't know if I wanted to go back to living with my mother, and that admission felt like the second hardest true thing I'd ever said out loud, after the first conversation with Ms. Holloway back in October. Ms. Petrosky told me that was allowed. That wanting something complicated, something that didn't resolve into a clean yes or no, wasn't a failure of loyalty. It was just honesty, and honesty, she reminded me, was the thing that had gotten us this far already. My mother was charged with fraud several months later, misuse of disability assistance funds, filing false claims, and a related charge connected to the transfers into my aunt's account. I wasn't in the courtroom for most of it. I was, by then, 12, old enough to understand the broad shape of what was happening even though the specific legal language mostly went past me. She didn't go to prison, in the end. The sentence involved probation, mandated repayment, and a permanent disqualification from receiving disability assistance funds on behalf of a minor again. I understood, reading about it later, that the system had decided the most useful outcome wasn't necessarily punishment in the way an 8-year-old imagines punishment, bars, a cell, a door that locks, but restriction. A structural admission that she could not be trusted with that kind of responsibility again, made official, made permanent, made a matter of record instead of a private failure absorbed quietly inside our apartment the way it always had been before. I didn't go back to living with her. By the time the case resolved, I had been with the Whitfields for over a year, and what had started as a temporary placement had become, through a series of conversations I was included in rather than simply informed of, something more permanent. I still saw my mother sometimes, supervised, at first monthly and then less often, and those visits were strange and stilted in a way that never entirely resolved, because you cannot unhear a phone call where your own mother tells someone that you're too young to hold a story together. I held it together anyway. That was the part she never accounted for. I'm 19 now. I still wear a brace, though a much smaller and lighter one than the models I grew up with, fitted correctly, on schedule, by a clinic that has a full, accurate, boring record of every single appointment I've ever attended. I still think about Ms. Holloway sometimes, about the specific, undramatic way she asked to look at my leg that October morning, and how much of what came after depended entirely on the fact that she took 8-year-old me seriously in that moment instead of assuming I was exaggerating, or confused, or simply too young to know what I was talking about. People sometimes ask me, when they learn the shape of what happened, whether I regret telling Ms. Holloway that day, whether the year of upheaval that followed, the temporary placement, the courtroom, the permanently strange relationship with my mother, feels like too high a price for a truth that could have, theoretically, stayed contained inside our apartment a while longer. I don't regret it. I think about the sores on my leg that never should have gotten as bad as they did, about the sessions with Coach Dana that quietly disappeared from the calendar while a television too big for our wall appeared instead, and I understand, more clearly now than I could have at 8, that the price of staying quiet wasn't actually lower. It was just less visible, paid slowly instead of all at once, by a kid who didn't yet have the words to explain what was happening to her. I kept the receipts, in the end, not literal ones, but something close enough. A memory precise enough to survive an adult's certainty that I couldn't hold a story together. It turned out I could. It turned out that was exactly the thing she should have been worried about all along.